So before I move into the lesson, we're going to jump into blood pressure today. I brought my blood pressure cuff. I brought my stethoscope. So we will talk a little bit about that today, and how to measure blood pressure. I think it's good to practice that if those of you are going into the doctoral program, if that's your goal. It's something good to do, especially if you're going to have a face-to-face meeting with your client, to get their blood pressure on both arms, as Dr. Morris mentioned last time. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. But you all should get a link to my personal calendar, and you'll see the dates where I'm available for one-on-one tutoring. So I'll be offering just to the students enrolled in the school one-on-one tutoring. And that's part of, all colleges offer that to students that enroll into a program. You need help and assistance as you're going through that. So you'll have access to those tutoring sessions as well.
Before I found out about that was, I don't know if you're gonna let me know if I should stop and you'll cover this later about the capillary beds. So I'm imagining the blood going in, there's a bed, and then the lymph pulling out. But the blood, it's a loop. Where does the blood go back to from the arteries, the arterial direction to the venous direction?
Well, at the other end of the capillary is a vein. So it goes from the arterial to a capillary bed to a vein. In fact, what I'll do really quick is I'll just show you a quick picture from the lymphatic system, because it shows it pretty well here. So here we're looking at, and this is from the next chapter 21, which goes over the lymphatic system. But here you can see an arterial, and branching off of that is the meta-arterial leading into our capillary bed.
Got it.
Capillaries are where exchange occurs. So this is where we're releasing the nutrients, we're releasing the oxygen, and then the blood goes into a venule. Now, kind of intermingled with the capillaries are the lymphatic vessels that are picking up the waste products. And they're one-way vessels. So it's not a circuit in the lymphatic system. It starts at the tissue. And so these cells, you can kind of see them in light yellow. They're constantly, releasing metabolic waste products. And a lot of those, or maybe even pathogens or things that shouldn't be there, toxins, are picked up by these lymphatic vessels and carried away. So that's how that works. So there's always going to be blood capillaries and lymphatic capillaries intermingled with our cells of every organ and tissue. So this is why Dr. Moore says we're basically just a bunch of cells and two major fluids. So we can see the vessels carrying those fluids.
Yes.
And these are the cells that are benefiting from the nutrition and also getting rid of their waste products. Does that help?
Yes, thank you so much, because I think I never got a good capillary picture. It looks more like netting with the fine, you know what I mean? It's more like a loose, it just looked like literally like a pond of water. But this gives me a better image, and it shows how it goes in the venous direction also. So thank you.
Yeah, the circulatory system is a circuit. So it's a, closed circuit, but the lymphatic system is not. And they're showing one of the lymphatic vessels here, black arrows indicating that it's just a one-way, taking the waste products away from the cells and their release of waste, and it all goes into the lymphatic.
Thank you.
Now, again, you'll see that I have some allopathic measurements here, because again, I teach the traditional allopathic anatomy and physiology courses, but I'm going to be mentioning reiterating what Dr. Morris said on Monday. So blood pressure is normally measured using the brachial artery, which is an artery that runs in the antecubital fossa. This is the antecubital region of the body, just the front of the elbow. And this is where the brachial artery is. In fact, I'd like all of you to kind of palpate more towards the pinky side, excuse me, and see if you can feel your brachial artery and feel that, because it's one of the arteries you can also use to measure your pulse. Normally we use radial artery or carotid artery, but brachial artery can be used. And it's good to be able to feel this on your own arm, because before you do a blood pressure reading on your patient's arm, you'll have to know where that artery is, because that's where you're going to be placing the stethoscope. So it's always a good idea to practice feeling the major superficial arteries, that is the arteries that are close to the surface of the skin. And these are arteries you can palpate for measuring the pulse, but this is also the brachial artery, also is the artery we use to measure blood pressure. And when we are measuring blood pressure, which I will explain how to do today, there are two numbers that we are going to be writing down. And I'm going to share with you some practice videos, and I will include these links. I'll probably put them in the chat box so you have those links to refer back to. And they're just, tutorials. And these are tutorials that I share from YouTube, so they're free for the world to watch. But I share these with my students at the college I teach at as well. So the two numbers are the systolic number, that's the top number in a blood pressure reading. And then the diastolic pressure, that's the bottom number. Technically, in the allopathic world, the systolic pressure is the pressure felt in an artery. And we're always using arteries when we measure blood pressure because these are the blood vessels receiving the blood. Remember, arteries carry blood away from the heart. So when the heart beats and it pushes the blood out, that blood is going into the artery. And the systolic pressure is the pressure felt in that artery when the heart is contracting. We call contraction systole. So systole is another name for contraction. And it's technically the ventricles, the lower chambers of the heart. When they contract, that's the pressure they are putting on the blood that they're forcing out, and it's being collected by the artery. And then when the ventricles of the heart relax, they're not pushing blood out. And so the pressure in the artery will be lower. That's the diastolic pressure. So we have two numbers because the arteries will experience two different pressures depending on whether the heart is actively contracting or it's relaxed. Obviously, in relaxed states, since there's no pumping of the blood, the pressure will be lower. So the bottom number should be lower than the top number. Now, as Dr. Morse explained on Monday, he equates the systolic pressure, the top number, to the pressure within the adrenal glands, and the bottom number, the diastolic pressure, as the pressure within the kidneys. So who can tell me, and I'll open up the chat box, who can tell me in the chat box what Dr. Morse explained to be a normal, healthy blood pressure reading? Open up that chat box again. Does anybody want to type it in? What was a normal, or I shouldn't say normal, but a healthy blood pressure reading according to Dr. Morse? And Ariel, perfect, you got it. So yeah, 120/60, that's what he likes to see. 120/80 has been kind of the norm that allopathic physicians put forth. So like for pre-nursing students, for pre-med students, I mean, this is what I tell my own students that a normal blood pressure reading is. In fact, what you see down here is what I specifically tell my students. And I wanted to share this with you because, going out into the world of health, a lot of the people you're going to be working with are coming from the allopathic system. I mean, typically people rarely find us as the first source of getting health. And usually they've gone to other types of physicians and that didn't work. So they're trying to find true remedy. And, so it's good to know where they're coming from. And you might be communicating with other practitioners that are coming from a different set of standards. So 120/60 is a traditional naturopathic blood pressure reading. And that 60 is a more healthier pressure felt in the kidneys. A pressure of 80 is a little bit too high. And so when the kidneys have too much pressure, that could force a variety of conditions, and it puts a bit of undue stress on the kidneys as well. But in males, blood pressure tends to run a little bit higher. In females, a little bit lower, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you do have lower blood pressures in males as well, but you do see it higher because men have testosterone and other hormones that can build that pressure up a little bit higher. So 120/80, 110/70, those are the allopathic definitions. And let me just make sure I don't have anybody else coming into the class. Okay, we're good. But 120/60 is Dr. Morse's explanation of what a healthy blood pressure is. Now, I'll talk a little bit about things that can affect blood pressure, which I mentioned down here at the bottom. So blood pressure is directly related to something called cardiac output. This was mentioned in the chapter 19 discussion. Cardiac output is basically the amount of blood our heart pumps out every minute. So if that amount is higher, that's going to put more pressure in the blood vessels, and that's going to cause a higher blood pressure. So they're directly related. Blood pressure is affected by blood volume. So people that have too much stuff in their blood, so it might be too much water in their blood, it might be too many cells in their blood, all of that extra stuff in the blood puts pressure against the walls of the blood vessels, and that also increases blood pressure. And then something called peripheral resistance, which is basically the resistance to blood flow. Basically, as our vessels constrict, that's going to increase the pressure that's going to be measured as well. So these all increase blood pressure. And we'll be talking about some of these a little bit later as we move forward. But before I get further into a discussion of blood pressure, I want to share, and you might not have this in your lesson notes, but I wanted to share a couple of slides here. So this is, these are some notes that I give to my allopathic students when we do our training lab on measuring the health of the cardiovascular system. So pulse is something you might want to measure on your patients or clients. Basically with pulse, you're palpating a superficial artery. So we have two different types of arteries that course through the body. Some are superficial, meaning that they're closer to the surface of the skin, and others are deeper within the body, so they're harder to palpate. The ones that we palpate are these superficial arteries, and that's what we use to measure pulse. So here you can see the most commonly used arteries that you can palpate. There's two that are more commonly used than the others, but the carotid artery in the neck, so the upper part of the neck, and I'll just ask that you try to feel yours, okay? Don't do both at the same time because I don't want you to cut off blood flow, but use one or the other. And then the radial artery is on the thumb side of the wrist. And whenever you're measuring pulse, use these two fingers. Don't use your thumb because your thumb has an artery passing within it. And some people can mistake their own pulse for that of their patient. So it's better to use these two fingers, or some people use 3 fingers, but never use the thumb to measure pulse. The brachial artery, like I said, it's on the inside of the elbow. So when your palm is facing forward, that's what we call the correct anatomical position. You can see this man is in the anatomical position. His palms are forward. So the brachial artery is a little bit more on the inside of that antecubital fossa. The facial artery can be kind of challenging. This is a smaller artery, but you can still feel it right along your lower jaw, which is called the mandible. This is where the facial artery runs. You might be able to feel it on your jaw. I sometimes have a hard time finding that one. On the sides of your temples, that's the temporal artery. So you might be able to feel the temporal artery. And then we call this the inguinal region, but this is where the femoral artery passes from inside of the abdominal region. It runs down the leg, so the femoral artery. I usually tell people not to palpate this one unless you really know your patient quite well, and normally this one is not appropriate to palpate, but it's good to know that it's there because you never know. Like in a medical setting, if you're going into a hospital room, you can have a patient with bandages all over, and maybe this is the only artery you can feel, right? So it's good to know where multiple arteries are found. In case you have a patient without arms or a patient with bandages. And then behind the knee we have the popliteal artery. This artery is also used to measure blood pressure in some cases. So, again, if you have, let's say you had a patient that had a double mastectomy and they took lymph nodes from both sets next to both breasts. And they have swelling in both arms because of that, because whenever you remove lymph nodes, you also remove lymphatic vessels, and you're removing the route to remove the waste products from the breast tissue, and fluid builds up in these arms, and then you can't get a good reading. So you might have to put the cuff around the knee and measure it at the popliteal artery. And then on the, there's a couple of arteries in the ankle region. We have on the top of the foot, and this one's always hard for me to find, but on the top of the foot, you have the dorsalis pedis artery. And then the one I find a little bit easier, this is what is on the inside of your ankle, the posterior tibial artery. But it's good to know where all of these are. Another good thing about these arteries is that they can serve as points of pressure. So in a situation, let's say you come across somebody that's bleeding from an artery. Now, the arteries we mentioned last time are under a large amount of pressure. So when you sever an artery, the blood's not just going to trickle out. It would do that when a vein has been cut open, but when an artery has been cut open, because the pressure is so high in the artery, the blood squirts out under high pressure. And most of our arteries are in the systemic circuit, so it's going to be bright red, oxygen-rich blood. And by the fact that it's squirting out, that means the patient's losing a lot of blood. And that could cause them to lose so much blood that they go into circulatory shock. So one thing you can do if you see this happening, so let's say, for example, let's say someone severed their leg. So let's say maybe they had a saw out and they cut through the back of their leg and they severed an artery. And right here, all of this bright red blood is squirting out. What you can do is you can go upstream. So we would go upstream closer to the heart, and we would put pressure on the popliteal artery, and that would slow the loss of blood from this artery in the back of the leg. And then hopefully somebody else is there, calling the emergency team to come in, because this person would definitely need to get to a hospital. Remember, we don't poo-poo allopathic medicine in all cases. In emergencies, allopathic medicine is quite remarkable because they can save people's lives. So get them onto an ambulance, get them to the emergency room so they can sew up that bleeding artery and prevent too much blood from being lost. So you just go upstream to the nearest place where you would normally measure pressure, pulse, and you put pressure there to slow the loss of blood. All right, so let's go to blood pressure reading. So I'm going to show you, this is a blood pressure cuff. It's called a sphygmomanometer. And during the pandemic, I would never say pandemic to my allopathic students. I just say this to you, because you guys get where I'm coming from. But over the pandemic, when I had to teach online, because our college was closed, we sent our students kits, so they can do all of these things they would normally do in lab. They were doing them at home. So we sent all of our students blood pressure cuffs, and these are called sphygmomanometers. A sphygmomanometer is a blood pressure cuff, and it's got this little dial on it. And I'll be showing you some videos on how to use this. And the students also received a stethoscope. So you do need to manually measure blood pressure. You need a stethoscope and a sphygmomanometer, which is a blood pressure cuff. And I'm going to go again over a video to show you how to place the blood pressure cuff on your patient. There's a couple of things though, so I'm going to be showing two different videos here in just a second, because the second video does address one of the concerns Dr. Morse mentioned on Monday about when you're doing a blood pressure reading. You don't want to pump up the blood pressure cuff too high. You want to make sure that you only pump it up high enough to address the type of measurement your patient has on average. So I'll show you how to do that appropriately. But you wrap around the brachial artery. So this blood pressure cuff is wrapped around that brachial artery. You palpate it where the brachial artery is on your patient. So that's where you're going to be placing the stethoscope. And as you listen with the stethoscope, you're going to hear little noises, which we call carot cough sounds. Karatkoff sounds. And what you see over here on this side of the image, basically when you're pumping up this blood pressure cuff, you are cutting off blood flow in the brachial artery. So you pump it up high enough so that you completely compress the brachial artery, so no blood's passing through it, right? So that's where it can be a little bit dangerous when you're doing this. So you only want to pump it up, start listening to the noises, and then slowly release, because ideally we want our arteries to be open so they can deliver, you know, in this case, blood to our arm and wrist and fingers, right? Because we don't want blood flow to stop to those tissues. And if you pump it up too high, if anything's in this blood vessel, a very high pressure can dislodge it. And then you have a clot that is flowing through the body. We call that an embolus. And an embolus is dangerous in a downstream vessel. So we don't want those things to happen. And that's why I'm show how to do these blood pressure readings. I mentioned it. So there are concepts that I think is a little separate. This is steps. That's why we steps to do this. And here's another picture showing the placement of the stethoscope, and placement of the blood pressure cuff. Now they're going with a typical reading of 120/70, so that's a little bit better than the normal allopathic reading. But again, you pump it up. Usually we go about 30 over, so I'll show you kind of how to figure out, or the video will show you how to figure out how high to pump it initially. So you go 30 over for where you should start. So if our patient, let's say, has a blood pressure normally at 120 systolic, you would go up to 150 when you initially pump it up. So pumping it up to 150 and then you slowly release. There's a little valve that is next to the pump that you open up to release the pressure. And then the first tapping noise you hear is the systolic pressure, so that you might hear at 120. And the last tapping noise is the diastolic pressure. All right. So let's watch some video I prepared. So this is video number 1. This guy does a very good introduction to how to measure blood pressure. And then we'll watch a video 2. She talks about some safety ways to make sure we're not pumping it up too high. So we'll watch this one first. And again, these 2 videos, I will copy the link and I'll put it in the chat box. Wait. I'll do that when we're done watching it.
I'm Josh Ferguson. Several steps in taking a blood pressure measurement. Step must be completed with accuracy. This is especially true when viewing the blood pressure dial and listening with a stethoscope. You must be able to effectively coordinate what you're hearing with what you're seeing. Just imagine if you report the patient's blood pressure as normal, when in actuality, their pressure was extremely high and they were at risk for having a stroke. Your inaccuracy can have dire consequences on the patient's overall health. This lesson will help you achieve accuracy when taking blood pressure measurements. By the end of this lesson, you will identify and interpret the graduation markings on an aneroid sphygmomanometer dial, and determine the systolic and diastolic blood pressure by reading the dial and listening to the Karatkoff sounds. If you ever had your blood pressure taken, you likely noticed that the results were stated as one number over the other number, such as 120/80. The number on top, in this case 120, represents systolic pressure, and the bottom number, in this case 80, represents the diastolic pressure. Let's take a close look at the dial used for determining such a measurement. This is the aneroid sphygmomanometer dial, also known as the blood pressure dial. The dial has the letters mmHg because blood pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. Also on the dial, you'll notice that there are lines in various sizes. The largest lines represent values of 20. This is 20, this is 40, 60, and so on. The medium lines represent values of 10. This is 30, 50, 70, and so on. The And the smallest line represents values of 2. So that line represents 22, 24, 26, 28, and so on. Now let's use a needle to determine the number displayed on the dial. Concentrate on the flip of the needle and the line that it's pointing to. How much does this line represent? If you say it's 60, you are correct. So how much does this line represent? If you say that 120, then how much does this line represent? If you stated 294, you are absolutely correct. Great job. Now that you're comfortable with reading the blood pressure dial, let's apply audiovisual coordination skills. And for this, please increase your volume level and have a pen and paper on hand. There are 2 main areas that you need to focus on when determining a blood pressure reading. 1, the position of the needle on the dial, and 2, the Korotkov sounds. We will refer to the Korotkov sounds as thumping sounds for the duration of this video. When you arrive at the point of the procedure, when you slowly deflate the cuff to hear the sounds, you will notice the needle move in a counterclockwise direction. It is at this point that you need to listen very closely for the thumping sounds. Upon hearing the first thump, note the needle's position on the dial and record the number. That's the systolic pressure. As the cuff deflates and the needle continues to move, you will continue to hear the thumping sounds. Listen closely for the last thump. Upon hearing the last thump, note the needle's position on the dial. That's the diastolic pressure. Let's practice applying these 2 steps. Please note that your answer may be slightly different from what's displayed, but that's okay. As long as your answer is within 4 millimeters of mercury, your answers are still considered accurate. For example, if the displayed answer is 120/80, but your answer was somewhere in the range of 118/78 through 122/82, your answer is still considered accurate. Of course, matching the displayed answer is the goal to achieve the most accurate answer. We'll use 114/76 as an example. All right, so now that you know the basics, let's try a few simulations. Listen closely and write down your answers. I will reveal the correct answer once the simulation ends. Here's the first one.
Loretta. Loretta.
Try another. Okay, let's try one more. So, did you answer all of them correctly? Great job. Give yourself a huge pat on the back for a job well done. There's so much more to learn about blood pressure, especially when it comes to the terminology, ranges, and the many steps involved in the process. Continue to discover, review, and practice as much as you can to master the art of measuring blood pressure correctly. And there you have it. You have learned to identify and interpret the graduation markings on an aneroid sphygmomanometer dial, and determine the systolic and diastolic blood pressure by reading the dial and listening to the Korotkoff sounds. To stay up to date on other allied health learning tools, you can follow me on Twitter at AHTools1 or subscribe to my Allied Health Tools YouTube channel. Thank you for watching this video.
All right. So that I will share that link with you all. But did you all feel like that was a good way to measure it? And there are lots of tutorial links about how to get used to what you need to listen to, because as clinicians, your ears are quite important. You know, basically everything you see, you hear, even you smell, it's all clinically significant information. So, you know, you want to practice listening, whether it's to, you know, the sounds of these Korotkoff thumping noises when you're listening to blood pressure, or you're listening to anything else, even listening to the heart directly with the stethoscope. Now, the next video that I'm going to share with you is, let's see, was it this one? Yeah, it was this one. This one, she does go through some of the similar ways of how to place the blood pressure, but she also shares with you, which is why I like to share this video, how do you know how high to pump the blood pressure cuff up to before you start releasing the pressure slowly? Because in that last example, especially for that blood pressure reading where it was like 96/55, he started at like 180 or 200. That was way too high to start at for somebody whose blood pressure is normally a systolic reading of 95. So you only want to go 35. And then how do you know how high to go? Well, this woman's going to show you. It's basically associated with measuring the brachial artery and pumping it up and finding out where the pressure in the brachial artery stops. So we'll watch this. And it might be a little bit of a review from the last video, but it never hurts to hear this twice. And just so you know, there's lots of these videos on YouTube. So, you know, the beautiful thing about the internet these days, you can get plenty of free training just by, you know, typing in, you know, blood pressure tutorials or listening to blood pressure practice exercises, lots of things to help you become a really good clinician. So we'll watch this next video and then we'll take it from there. What's up, everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to take a manual blood pressure reading, which will be Korotkoff sound with S1 and S2 as a live demo. My name is Katina and the practitioner. Let's get started. Okay, so if you have hygiene, when you enter the patient's room, and you want to make sure you have all your supplies with you, which will consist of a manual, a blood pressure cuff, and your stethoscope. So you're going to introduce yourself to the patient if you haven't already done so. You want to make sure that the patient is in a comfortable position, and if they are seated, you want to make sure that their legs are not crossed. You want to make sure that their arm is comfortable and that the patient is comfortable along with you as well. You also want to make sure that the patient's elbow is at about the level of their heart. And if they're lying flat, the same would apply as far as the level of the elbow being at the heart. So I'm going to apply the blood pressure cuff. I want to make sure that it's the right size, it's not too small, too large, it's just right for the patient. I also want to make sure, ideally, I always like to check the left arm. However, that may not be the case. I may have to avoid that arm if they possibly have an IV on that site, if they have a TBT such as a clot, if they had a mastectomy. So I would definitely want to avoid that site, or if they had a fistula. So when I apply the cuff, I want to make sure that it's 2 inches above the bend or crease of the arm. So I'm going to apply this, and before I apply it, I also, on the cuff, if you notice, there's a right arm versus the left arm. Since we're going to go in the left arm, there's an arrow pointing down. That arrow specifies because I need to place it in the brachial artery, which is always in the inner arm of the cell. So I'm going to apply it here where the brachial artery is towards, and I'm going to up it around
identify the excess of the sleeve. And then I'm going to check the brachial artery and palpate for it, so I know where I'm gonna be putting my valve and my stethoscope. So I feel it, it's nice and down there. I'm not pushing too hard because I don't want it to occlude. So what I want to check here is for the oscillatory gap. And what that means is I want to make sure there's no type of erroneous errors, meaning this is for like the hypertensive patient. So I want to make sure when I am going to check the blood pressure that it doesn't give me an underestimated systolic reading or an overestimated diastolic reading. So how I do that is when I'm applying pressure here with the bulb, I'm going to inflate it. And when I feel the brachial artery is stopped palpating, I need to look at the gauge and see where it stops at. So if it stops at, let's say 100, and then I'm going to go 30 millimeters of mercury above that, which would be 130. So let's see what number this gives me right now. I'm going to palpate. I feel it. I'm going to inflate. And it stopped at 120. And I'm going to slowly release that. Release the millimeters of mercury. So it stopped at 120 for me. So that means that I'm going to inflate it at 150 millimeters of mercury.
So does that make sense to everyone? This is really the part of this video that I wanted you to see, because this is sharing with you how you know how high to pump your blood pressure cuff up to. So you don't want to pump it all the way up to 200, right? Because that could be too high for somebody and that could be dangerous. So you're palpating the brachial artery, and you'll feel it. You'll feel it like a normal pulse. You pump up the cuff, and at some point that pulse stops. You make note of where it stops. So for this person, it stopped at 120. So if it stops at 120, when she actually does the blood pressure reading again later, she'll pump it up to 150. You always go 30 above where it stopped. Okay, and that's a safe level to go above. You don't want to go 50 above, you don't want to go 100 above. That's way too high and it could be dangerous for your patient. We'll just continue watching this video because she does go over some of the features that were discussed in the last video. So it never hurts to see those again.
Okay, and then just to take it a step further, with the protocol for readings, they go into phases. So phase 1 through phase 5. So phase 1 is that sharp tapping sound, which is your systolic sound. So that's that first sound that you hear, and you're going to see on the needle. I'm about to show you a live demo on it. It's going to oscillate a little bit. You're going to see it move, and you're also going to hear it as well. So I would suggest that you use a headphone set so that way you can be able to hear everything. Okay, and then in addition to that, phase 2 would be the whoosh, phase 3 would be the thump, and phase 4 would be a muffled sound. With phase 5 is silent, so that would be your diastolic. So take a listen.
All right, and like I said, there's lots of these tutorials. So there's one that I share with my students when I go over blood pressure assessments. So this is it's called audio enhanced blood pressure, and it's like a series, and all it is they show somebody, you know, pumping this up on a living person, and they audio record it, and then you're just listening to the noises and reading the dial. Then they tell you what the actual blood pressure was, but it's giving you a chance to practice. And these cuffs, by the way, I would, you know, if this is something you're serious about using in your future practice, you can probably get a practice cuff, relatively cheap, even on Amazon, or go to various, you know, if you have like a medical school or a nursing school in your area, a lot of times those schools will sell stethoscopes and blood pressure cuffs. So these are things you can purchase And, if you're gonna be truly using this in your practice, you probably want to get a really good one. So it's a practice cup I wouldn't use on a real patient. This is just what we use in a training setting. But, there are, and you can tell price wise, if it's really expensive, it's a good one. If it's pretty cheap, it's going to give you the basics, but it's a good one for practice. There is a couple of questions that came in. What do you know if the person has blood that is too thick? So thick blood, that could be like polycythemia, excuse me. Again, that's just going to probably express itself as a high blood pressure in many cases. So you can still measure blood pressure. It's not dangerous, if they have a condition called polycythemia, which is basically too many red blood cells being produced in the red bone marrow. So there could be something stimulating the red bone marrow. And then for the connection between the diastolic pressure and the kidneys, so the diastolic pressure, according to how Dr. Morris explained this on Monday, that's the pressure felt within the kidneys. So the kidneys have blood vessels passing through them. And there's small little capillaries in the kidneys called glomeruli. And we don't want the pressure there to be too high because, capillaries are very thin vessels. And if the pressure is really high, those could burst open. And when they burst open, whatever they release is being released ultimately into the urine. So really high blood pressure and really high pressure in that diastolic reading, especially, you can see things like blood in the urine because the pressure is so high in those capillary beds, it's bursting the capillary open, releasing the red blood cells and the white blood cells and the plasma. It's all going into the urine. And then you see these things in the urinalysis. And so that's not a good sign for sure. So we don't want the pressure, that bottom number, to be too high. Dr. Morris likes it around 60. That's a healthy pressure where those glomeruli are not stressed too much. And remember what the kidneys are doing. All they're doing is they're removing excess from the blood. So too much water in the blood, we remove some of that into the urine. Too much sodium in the blood, we remove that into the urine. Other things that the blood carries, like glucose, you should never see glucose in the urine because the body values all simple sugars. So glucose and fructose, the body will retain that always. And if we have too much simple sugar, we store it as glycogen or we convert it to something else like fat. But we would not release that into the urine. But most other things can be released into the urine. And then what otherwise happens to an embolus that doesn't break free from a blood pressure measurement? Well, when you have a clot on the lining of a blood vessel, when it's stuck against the blood vessel wall, we call that a thrombus. When it's been detached, then it's called an embolus. So technically an embolus is when it is moving around in the blood circulation, and those are dangerous. An embolus is much more dangerous than a thrombus because as it's moving through the blood circulation, and it might go into one of those smaller branches, it can block blood flow. And if that smaller branch is going to your brain, that can result in a stroke. If that smaller branch is going to your heart, that can result in a heart attack. So that's why an embolus is so dangerous. Now, a thrombus can be dangerous too. It's usually something that's lacking on the inside of the blood vessel wall. We showed this on Monday when I was, there was a picture of a blood clot building up in the endothelium, just next to the endothelium of a blood vessel. And when it builds up there, it's in the blood vessel wall, that's a thrombus. And so if it builds up too much though, even if it's attached to the blood vessel wall, it's just getting too big, when it gets big enough, then that thrombus can also block blood flow. So a thrombus can be dangerous, but when it's circulating, it's a little bit more dangerous, if that makes sense. All right, and then let's see what else we have. How does the diastolic blood pressure bring up artificially the systolic? Well, the pressure in the blood vessels it's high or low. So Usually when the diastolic is elevated, the systolic is also elevated because overall there's just too much pressure in our blood vessels. So we might have too much fluid in the blood, we might have too much constriction, or there could be too much cholesterol or calcifications building up in the wall of the blood vessel. And Dr. Morse, if you've taken Dr. Morse's ISOD classes, ISOD 1 and ISOD 2, I think he mentions this in ISOD 1, if I'm not mistaken. But there are 3 things that acids and other toxic accumulations attract when they're found in our tissues. And our blood vessels are made up of tissue layers. We looked at the 3 layers, the tunica intima, the tunica media, and the tunica adventitia or externa last time. So those tissues can become acidic, and to put out the fire of acidosis, we can do that with water, we can do that with fat like cholesterol, or with calcium. So the acidosis of, let's say, the tunica intima will attract the cholesterol or attract the calcification, and that builds up and that narrows the lining of the blood vessel, which is going to increase the pressure. So there's a relationship between volume and pressure. As the volume decreases, as we're making the blood vessel smaller volume, the pressure goes up. So whenever you have a container with stuff in it, when you make that container smaller, the stuff in it is putting more pressure against the walls of that container. So that's why it's dangerous to have those things build up in your blood vessel walls, because it increases blood pressure, and hypertension or high blood pressure, even in the allopathic community, is called the silent killer because it puts a lot of stress on those blood vessels. We mentioned the blood vessels in the kidneys, those little capillaries in the kidneys, they can burst open, releasing blood into the urine. But that can happen anywhere in the body, where the blood vessels can burst open anywhere. And, sometimes the walls of the blood vessels become weakened. You see this with a parathyroid weakness, when those connective tissues aren't strengthened to hold the integrity of the blood vessel, and the blood vessel starts to balloon. If you've ever had like a regular balloon and the wall of the balloon kind of becomes weak, it kind of pockets out. Well, that can happen in our blood vessels. And where it pockets out, that region of the blood vessel becomes very weak. We call that an aneurysm. And an aneurysm is dangerous because if the pressure gets even higher, it can burst that aneurysm open. And if it's a major blood vessel, let's say in a major artery, you can bleed internally and lose so much blood that you can't stay alive anymore. You go into circulatory shock, which we will be going into detail about what circulatory shock is in just a second. Let's get back to these blood pressure questions. These are great, and I want to include this in the lesson because your questions will help future students. Stephanie has a question. I don't totally understand the last thump of the diastolic measurement. So it's when you stop hearing the tapping noises. So let me stop sharing my screen so I can show you my blood pressure cuff for just a second. So, you've got your blood pressure cuff, and I know they mentioned this in some of the videos. So it's kind of showing you, can you guys all see me? Okay. So it's showing you with that little downward arrow where to place the blood pressure cuff, because that needs to go right above the brachial artery. So you palpated your patient's brachial artery, and that's where you're placing your cuff. Now, your cuff is connected to this bulb, and next to the bulb is this dial. So the dial turns righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. And let me see, someone's in the waiting room. And you want to make sure the dial is open so that the pressure in this cuff is empty. So you want to squeeze all the air out, and then you tighten the cuff, and then you can pump it, right? And when it's tightened and you pump, then the dial will go up. Oh, I've got to pump it up because I don't have it on an arm. This is, I would do this on another human if I was in a classroom setting, but since I have dogs with me and I don't know how to measure blood pressure on a dog, so I'm not going to put them through that trauma. So you probably won't like them. You can see the dial going up. So that you go up, and remember, you want to go 30 above where the brachial artery could not be felt when you were doing your initial assessment. You go 30 above. And then at some point, you're going to start releasing it. So you're listening with the stethoscope, you start releasing. And the very first tapping noise, that's going to be the top number. That's the first sound you hear. So let's say it ended here. So this is a low blood pressure, 95. So that was the top number. And you'll get patients with a systolic reading of 95. Right? That means their adrenal glands are weak. And then you continue to release and you keep hearing those tapping noises. And then eventually the tapping noises go away. The last tapping noise, you make note of what the pressure was. So let's say it was 60. That's your diastolic pressure. That's the bottom number. Does that make sense to everyone? When you're doing the measurement? And so that's where you need practice listening. So I'll give you some YouTube links that have practice tutorials where you can just know what to listen for. And if you have somebody at home that you can practice listening to, that's great. Again, one thing I always warn people about when you're doing practice blood pressure readings, I would tell this to my students in the classroom, is that when you're practicing on your lab partner, do one arm, measure it once, and if you can get a reading, great. If you can't get a reading, let's say you couldn't hear anything or you released the pressure and the dial went down too fast, that happens quite a bit, and you didn't hear the numbers appropriately, then switch to the other arm. Don't do the same arm twice or 3 times in a row. Because remember, every time we pump up the blood pressure cuff, we're blocking the brachial artery, and we don't want to repeat that unnecessarily. So then you switch to the other arm, and Dr. Morse likes to do blood pressure readings on both arms anyway. Okay, it's good to get it on both. And when I worked in Dr. Morse's clinic, for every client that I worked with, I had 2 blood pressure readings, especially the ones that came into the practice to have a one-on-one session with me in person. So you want to get both readings anyway. But if you can't get the other reading because you made a mistake, again, just give your lab partner a break or give your person that you're working with a break. Because if you keep doing that repetitively, it can put some stress on the brachial artery. Okay, let's see. Diana has a question. How does sugar get into the urine? I have heard doctors say sugar in the urine is diabetes. Yes, sugar does get into the urine when you have hyperglycemia. So normally in a person that has normal blood sugar levels, the sugar is at a low enough level that it's not, well, first and foremost, when the blood flows through the kidneys, it's kind of like the blood dumps all of its stuff out and then it takes it back in again. So we filter a lot of stuff out of the blood and then we pull it back into the blood. So the kidneys are kind of remarkable in that respect. So they'll remove a bunch of water, a bunch of sodium, a bunch of potassium, a bunch of glucose, a bunch of fructose, all of the simple sugars, amino acids. It all gets emptied out. Not 100%, but a lot of it. And then a little bit later, the kidneys bring it back into the blood, right? And normally 100% of the sugar that was released goes back in. It's not initially released into the urine, it's released into a fluid called filtrate, but we pull it back into the blood because 100% of the glucose and fructose should come back into the blood. When you have hyperglycemia, high blood glucose, you have way too much glucose in the blood. Now, fructose, by the way, is not what they're measuring in diabetes mellitus. They're only measuring glucose because that's the one that the tests recognize. But 100% of the glucose is brought back into the blood. But if you have too much glucose in the blood and you filter it all out, you can't reabsorb it back into the blood. Some of it stays and will end up in the urine. And that's where you're going to see glucose in the urine. It's just because it maxes out the reabsorption transport because they have way too much glucose. So it's not normal to have glucose in the urine. And so whenever somebody has a urinalysis, And you can actually buy a urinalysis kit in most local pharmacies and drugstores. They have those little dipsticks. So you urinate into a cup, you put the stick in there, and it has little squares, and the squares will change color depending on what findings there are. So they might be measuring, glucose, they might measure pH of the urine, ketones, there's a lot of things, creatinine. I don't know if they measure creatinine, but proteins they can test for in the urine. And yeah, so that's what you're looking for in the urine, and you shouldn't have glucose in the urine. If it is, it's a red flag, and we call that diabetes mellitus, most notably. And so the tapping noises are technically called the carotid cough sounds. There we go. Okay, so carotid cough sounds are the medical name we give to anything you hear with a stethoscope inside of the body. So you hear these in the blood vessels, in the arteries when you're measuring blood pressure. And here is the name of the blood pressure cuff. This is the kind of clinical name, sphygmomanometer. And again, we're placing that on the brachial artery. And that's just the tapping noises. So sometimes for short, we call them tapping noises. So the first tapping noise is the systolic pressure. That's the top number. The last tapping noise, so after the last noise, you don't hear anything after that, that's the diastolic pressure. And then other things you can, connect to blood pressure readings. There's something called pulse pressure, which is basically the difference between the top number and the bottom number. That's the pulse pressure. And that's going to be 40 in the case of 120/80. So yeah, the pulse pressure is the difference between the top number and the bottom number. That's called pulse pressure. Again, 40 is something Dr. Morse probably wouldn't like to see. He'd prefer to see 60, right? Because 120 minus 60 is a pulse pressure of 60. The pulse pressure is giving us kind of an idea of, well, it does have some clinical correlation. So I gave some examples in the second bullet point here. So if the pulse pressure is too low, and I would say a pulse pressure of 40 is a low number, right? Even though it's, normal for the allopathic community. But if it's below 40 for sure, usually that's associated with poor heart function. So when there's a smaller difference between the top number and the bottom number, that means the heart's not that healthy, right? And if it's a lot bigger, so let's say greater than 60, maybe it's 70, maybe it's 80, that's usually associated with leaky heart valves. So like mitral valve prolapse, or the valves are regurgitating. So the heart valves, they ensure that the blood flow is going unidirectional through the heart, and we don't want the blood to backflow. So in A&P part 2, which this live session will be a part of, that will include the previous lessons that we did in the live format over the heart and the blood. Another thing high pulse pressure might indicate is the loss of the aortic elasticity. The aorta is the largest artery in the human body, and it's the main artery that's receiving blood into the systemic circuit. Peter is asking, is filtrate storage from the bloodstream shared with the lymphatic pathway? So Peter, that's a great question, and I will be talking about that in the lymphatic system lessons. So you're kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but that's perfectly good because these are great questions. But filtrate is simply the name of the fluid that's released from the blood in the kidneys. Allopathically, they don't show lymphatic vessels in the kidneys, but there are lymphatic vessels in the kidneys. I'm not sure exactly where the lymphatic vessels are located, but I think they might be wrapped around the glomeruli. So I will be kind of offering my theory of where those lymphatic vessels are. But according to the allopathic system, only the blood is filtered at the kidneys, not the lymph. So they do not show, nor as any textbook that I've ever learned from or taught out of has ever mentioned that the waste products in the lymph are passing via the kidneys into the urine. They just ignore it, or they don't even think about it. So Dr. Morse has been the only person to offer that explanation of how these waste products get out of the body. So what the allopaths recommend is that, or they suggest that the lymph, which is carrying these waste products, it's all being dumped back into the blood. So we take these wastes from tissues, we carry them in lymphatic vessels, then we just dump it back into the blood later. And Dr. Morse doesn't think that that makes much sense, because why would we want to dump waste back into our blood when we already removed the waste products?